I'm AbiNader, the Vice President for Policy at the ATFL. Welcome to today's webinar, Crisis of Confidence. Lebanese reflect on their crises, their institutions, and their future. We will discuss the results of the recent Zogby Research Services poll, sponsored by the American Task on Lebanon and the Moisik Orlilo Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies at NC State University. The report and Dr. Zogby's presentation are available on our website, www.atfl.org. Let me repeat that again. The Dr. Zogby's presentation and the poll results are at www.atfl.org. To begin today's program, I'd like to ask Ambassador Gabriel, the President and CEO of ATFL, for his opening remarks. Ed?
Thank you, Jean. It's good to see you all. As Jean mentioned, I'm the president of the American Task Force for Lebanon. And I also want to welcome you to the launch of the Crisis of Confidence, the poll which looks at the Lebanese reflection on their crisis, their institutions, and their future. The poll was conducted by Zogby Research Services and co-sponsored by ATFL, and also the Khater Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies at North Carolina State University. I must say we are honored to sponsor this survey with Zogby Research Services. As this audience really knows, the polling conducted by Jim and his company are among the most respected in the region. In this case, though, Jim polled more than 800 Lebanese citizens from all walks of life, and on the ground, in-person interviews. Can you imagine, given this time in Lebanon, how difficult that is, conducting on-the-ground surveys with the fuel crisis, the financial crisis, and other challenges? It's a great testament to your great work, Jim, and your company. The findings that Jim will go into, I believe, will surely make headlines once you hear from him. And I hope inform policymakers on how they can strengthen the U.S.-Lebanon relationship. I'd also like to thank the Khater Center, which played a valuable role to us in shaping the questions for the survey. Now, Jim will follow me with a PowerPoint presentation on the results of the study. And then following his presentation, we'll have a panel discussion featuring three distinguished panelists, Paul Salem, president of the Middle East Institute, Moni Yacoubian, senior advisor to the vice president for Middle East and Africa at the U.S. Institute for Peace, and Jean AbiNader, vice president for policy at ATFL. He'll moderate this panel as well. Then following the panel discussion, there'll be time for Q&A from the audience. But before I turn this over to Jim, I want to share with you why we sponsored the survey. Number one, as Lebanon continues to destabilize, the international community continues to search for answers. Number two, the U.S. has provided large amounts of humanitarian aid and is the leading supporter of the Lebanese armed forces. Literally billions of dollars in aid have gone to Lebanon in the last decade. Number three, people are suffering. They continue to suffer in the midst of shortages of essential goods and services, massive inflation, growing insecurity, and rising sectarian tensions, and rising unemployment and poverty. And lastly, in the midst of all this suffering, we want to encourage the U.S. to reflect on how it can better tailor its assistance and support to meet the needs of the people. Now, you're going to see that while some of these challenges, some of the findings will be challenging, which Jim will go through, we think there are also some findings that show the international community and the U.S. on where to engage and how to engage. For example, let me give you a couple of facts. For example, 57% of the Lebanese expressed optimism that the March elections will bring political change. I should say the March or May elections will bring political change. 66% of the Lebanese also shared that they would be voting for new political parties. The poll further suggests that combating inflation and incentivizing reforms are ways we may be able to support the Lebanese people. It also tells us the U.S. should be firm in calling for open, fair, and transparent parliamentary elections that allow opposition candidates to get a fair chance to be heard and considered without fear of intimidation. But these are, there's more to this story than what I've just given you. I now want to turn over the next part of the program to my good friend, Jim Zogby. Thank this audience for joining in, and thank you, Jim, for all you've done. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Ed, and thanks to the Khater Center and the Lebanese Task Force for working with us to make this a successful venture. I appreciate your kind words about the poll, but I'm going to let the numbers speak for themselves. I just want to note that my brother and I started polling in Lebanon a couple decades ago. My brother John and I've been doing it alone since 2011. These numbers were striking. I remember saying at a poll we did back in 2006 that if politicians ran on what unites people in Lebanon, they would be overwhelmingly successful, but instead they usually focus on what divides. What was striking in this poll were the number of areas where there was a strong convergence of views. Contrary to the notion that Lebanese are divided, this poll shows that on many issues, really decisive issues, there's very significant unity. Let's go to the first one. Obviously, with regard to the conditions of daily life, there is obviously a convergence. I've never seen numbers like this. Almost 9 in 10 say that they're worse off than they were 5 years ago. We've always seen Lebanese numbers low, but never this low in terms of saying they're worse off than they were before. Let's look at the next one. Impacted by scarcities of fuel, electricity, and drinking water. This is another area of convergence where we find that the population has been profoundly impacted by the shortages. This one, I think, the next one is quite disturbing. It is on food insecurity. More than 1/3 go without food on some occasions, and among the poor, 1 in 5 very often go without meals. And let's look at the next one. As a result, on income, 2/3 say that they don't have enough income to make ends meet. Just as a side note, and rather for me was sort of tragic and shocking. In church one Sunday, during the prayers that they offer, they said, "And for those in the world who are destitute and living with hunger and profound poverty, those especially in Afghanistan, Haiti, and Lebanon." I was, my brain almost exploded. I said, how in just a few decades have we gone from where we were to being Afghanistan, Haiti, and Lebanon? But we're seeing here, people don't have food, they don't have fuel, they're dealing with shortages of all kinds, and 2/3 don't have income, enough income to covering expenses. As a result of that, let's look at the next slide. 2/3 say that they'd emigrate if given the opportunity. And of course, that number was higher among young people than among older people, but it was across the board, another point of convergence here. The countries that interestingly were the key destinations were the United States and Brazil, because there's huge emigre communities in both countries. Now it's going to get really interesting, because we're going to shift to away from the hardships to people looking at the institutions and the future. Confidence in institutions and movements. There's convergence around the first five. Usually if it's 2/3 or more, that is across the board support. And from every subgroup, we found the Lebanese armed forces, the civil society institutions, religious leadership, judiciary, and the October 17th Thawra movement had support across the board in varying degrees, but it was uniform. With Hezbollah, there was a division with stronger support among those in the Shia community, because Hezbollah represents a lot of things to them. No support almost in the Sunni community, and division among everybody else. Parliament and traditional political parties. Look at the traditional political parties, 19% confidence. That's not something you want to run on. That translates to an interesting next slide I want to point out. 2/3 of all in Lebanon, another point of convergence, believe that weapons or forces of the resistance should be under the control of the LAF. And look at that, goes across every sectarian community in the country. Sunni, Shia, Christians of the various denominations, and Druze all believe that weapons should be under the control of the LAF. Let's go to the next. There is confidence in the government of Najib Mikati. Not convergence. There wasn't, not every group felt that way, but there's still a majority who had support. And I want to go to the next one about countries that the Lebanese had confidence in and feel relations should be strengthened. Only France came off well. 49 strengthened, 24 reduced. I think it'd be shocking to political folks here in the United States to realize that Iran and the US were virtually tied in terms of confidence, in terms of wanting to strengthen ties or reduce ties. Syria and Saudi Arabia do very poorly, and Russia about the same strengthened ties as the US and Iran, but much greater feeling that ties should be reduced, largely, I think, because of their role in Syria at this point. Let's go to the next. Oh, let me just make a point too about this one. The Iran 34, 35 numbers and the Hezbollah numbers, while they might seem good, remember this poll was done during the period when oil shipments were coming in from Iran. And so it apparently didn't have, if it had any impact at all, it had only enough impact to create an even tie, 34, 35, and pretty much the same as the US. It didn't gain Iran or Hezbollah enormous political points in the country. Let's go to the next slide. 3 and 5 expressed confidence that elections are going to bring political change, the change that Lebanon needs. And this is interesting. We asked that, you saw the question before, are you better off or worse off? It was about 8% better off and the rest worse off. But what was most interesting was on the question, do you think you'll be better off in the next 5 years? And the numbers there were higher than I expected. It was 33% said that they thought they'd be better off. The interesting thing was that there was a convergence between those who thought they'd be better off and those who had optimism in the upcoming election, and those who said, as you'll see in the next slide, said that they'd vote, as Ed mentioned, for the alternative parties. So that there is there's an optimism in Lebanon about the next elections, which make this, without wanting to be exaggerating, my brother refers to different elections in America as Armageddon elections, that people have the feeling that it's the end of the world if the other side wins. I think without exaggerating here, I do think that this is a make it or break it election for Lebanon. The only people who have hope in the future are those who believe this election will make a difference, and that the alternative political parties can do it. So there's a lot riding on it. Let's go to the next one. You see it here, 2/3 in favor of supporting. Let's go back if you could, Kristen. Sorry. 2/3 voting for the alternative parties, 20 for the traditional parties. That 20 comes about the same as the 19% who said they had confidence in it, and the 66 is about the same as those who said they supported the October 17th Khater movement and civil society. So there really is here a convergence around the fact that something new is important to deal with the issues that plague the country. Let's go to the next one. 3 and 5 say that the Taif Accords should be rejected. And that's not just Taif, but it's Taif and everything that's come before, from the form of governance that was set up in the 30s by the French, that there should be a new constitutional model of governance that is not based on sectarian divisions in the country. That, I think, is really important for understanding where the culture is. We look at Lebanon as being a sectarian divided society. There are sectarian parties that operate and control ministries and make decisions to serve their own group and not other groups. But that doesn't appear to be where the people of Lebanon are. They seem to be in a very different place. We asked a question, one of the questions in the poll that I didn't report on was your preferred identity. Is it being Lebanese? Is it your sect? Is it your village? Is it 90%, I think it was 89% said that their preferred identity is being Lebanese. There's a sense here that there's an identity that transcends sect, and that comes through in several areas in the poll. Let's go to the next one. Overwhelmingly, the #1 issue in the country, when we asked them to rank 10 different issues, was corruption. You'll see in the full report that, how this tracked over time, but corruption has been raised to the #1 issue in the country and is recognized across the board by everyone from every sect. Let's go to the next one. This, I think, is important because there's there's a sense that, well, not everyone wants it. 97% said a full investigation and accountability for the explosion in the port of Beirut is important. So without a doubt, an issue of confidence in the country is that something has to give on that you cannot sweep it under the rug as the assassinations of Hariri and so many others were swept under the rug. People want answers to this one. It profoundly impacted the entire country, and 97% say there should be a full investigation and accountability. And let's go to the last one, which I think is, to me, was really quite heartwarming. I mean, I've been dealing with this issue of Syrian refugees. We did a study on the impact of refugees on the economy of Lebanon, on the people of Lebanon. It was profound. I mean, host communities were suffering. We do get reports of communities where there's unrest and there's tension between the refugees, but it was really heartwarming to see that 83% of Lebanese still say it's their humanitarian responsibility to take them in. And while there have been some effort to push them out, 71% say they should be able to stay until it's safe to return. And that, to me, was the final point of convergence, that Lebanon and the Lebanese people still have a sense of their responsibility and hospitality. And again, this was across the board with every sectarian community. So I'll stop there, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to make the presentation, but also to do the poll. It was really quite special.
Thank you, Jim. That was a great start to the conversation we're going to have. And I'd like to invite my colleagues, Paul Salem, the president of MEI, and Mona Yacoubian, the USIP senior advisor to the vice president of Middle East and Africa, to join me. But Jim, I can't be, or I would be remiss if I didn't look at this poll and try to understand how that convergences, the many convergences you spoke about, affects our perception of who the Lebanese are. I mean, you've got, as you say, you started this in what, 2002, the two of you?
Yes.
So we've had more than 20 years of insights into Lebanon and the people of Lebanon, the institutions of Lebanon. What seemed to be the biggest changes in your mind over those 20 years? I mean, where are the Lebanese people today that is very different from where they were in 2002?
Number one, I think that they're destitute. I mean, Lebanon is always I used to call it a grumpy country. I mean, there's countries like where things aren't going well, but people will always tell you things are good. There are countries that are doing well where people will always tell you that they're doing well. Like, UAE, the numbers when we poll there are always good because, frankly, people are doing pretty well there. Egypt, whether they're doing good or bad, they're always doing bad. I mean, that's another grumpy country. Lebanon's a grumpy country. We always get I'm not doing well. I wish I were doing. This is the first time, though, that I saw numbers like this. I mean, there clearly they are destitute. They are suffering. Fuel, food, when less than 10% say they're better off, usually I look at numbers like that. When we saw numbers like that in Egypt, you have a revolution. And I do think, Jean, that in terms of the convergence and the numbers of people who are looking at Lebanon in a different way, when I saw what happened on October 17th and the days that followed, and when you had a couple million people, I mean, that's a pretty substantial part of the population of a little country, right? Chanting all of them means all of them. There's something happening there. COVID, in a way, killed it because of the difficulties. And then clearly after the explosion, you had another setback to it. But I do think that what we're seeing in these numbers is a sense that people want change. They want an end to corruption. And they see this next election and the non-traditional parties as the way forward. That's the different thing here. People are looking forward to solutions and having a sense of optimism. They're destitute about the present, but they're optimistic about the future. That's new.
That's very Lebanese too, though, isn't it?
No, actually, like I said, I mean, the numbers that we got in 2019, the last poll we did in Lebanon were, I'm worse off than I was 5 years ago, and I'm going to be worse off in the next 5. I mean, there was no sense of optimism at all. And I think this is a little different.
Let me let our viewers know that if, as we go along, you're welcome to go to the chat function and put in your questions and comments, and we'll, after we have our initial discussion, we'll be going to Q&A for all of our presenters. So feel free to address any of your questions, either generally or to individual speakers on our chat function. Jim, just a reminder, I don't know if you remember, but my first trip to Lebanon was in '72, and you were also there. But I was in the city and meeting my cousins and going up to the village and all that kind of first time in visit. You were in the camps of Sabra and Shatila doing doctoral research. What was it like going back again to Lebanon? How many times have you been there recently, pre-COVID? And what do you sense is the difference now, even in that? I mean, for example, that's like one of the forgotten communities in Lebanon, except by the Lebanese or the Palestinian refugees. But refugees.
Actually, just a little. I was mostly in Ain al-Hilwi. Refugee was where I did my research. But yeah, I mean, the first time I went back after it was '71 that I was there. My wife and I were there with our little baby. The next time I went back was, I think, '78, and I was devastated by what I saw. I mean, we were 2 years into a civil war. Hamada Street was no longer the gleaming, street of lights and shops and busy. It was like there were posters of martyrs, etc., and buildings were pockmarked. And traveling from one side of the city to another was difficult. And then I went back many times after that. And I remember Rafiq Hariri had been someone who I knew and had become a friend before he was prime minister. And then after he was prime minister, when I'd go back, I'd see him and he'd always say, "We think the city now." And I told him one time, I said, people are complaining that you're focusing too much on Beirut and not enough on the rest of the country. And he said to me, "If the heart doesn't beat, the rest of the body doesn't get blood." He said, "We have to fix this first." And he did. There was no question that he did. But there were seeds of corruption and the sectarian divisions that had always been there that became so exaggerated. And after his assassination, I think the downward spiral began. And he was larger than life. Lebanon hasn't had a leader that was larger than life since then. And it needs that. It needs somebody that actually can inspire and has a vision for the future. And I dare say that I have not seen visionaries in Lebanon in political life in a while. So I think there is a depression. Village life continues as was. I mean, that's the weird thing is, we talk about resilience. It's almost irritating in a way, to go there and find people getting by and not, and that's why October 17th was so important to me. It was, for God's sake, be fed up with what's going on. And I think people are fed up right now, and that's coming through in the poll. So I'm glad that that's happening, and I have the same kind of hope that the people in Lebanon do, that something's going to give here, and we'll see something dramatic that makes change. And yeah, that's maybe a long-winded answer to a short question.
No, thanks, James, and pretty good for correcting my dates. It's when you get to my age to remember anything. Is it? Before we bring on
people every day, Sean.
Bringing on Paul and Mona now, let me remind you, and thanks, Ed, for the reminder, that you can use either the chat function or the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions and comments. And please feel free to do it. We really look forward to more of a discussion with you. Mona, let's start with you. What were your major takeaways from seeing the results of this poll?
Thanks, Jean, and thanks to ATFL for including me, and congratulations, Jim, on your poll. It's really fascinating. I think I was struck, by a couple of things. One is just to me, this poll was a study in contrasts, and it really underscores the complexity of Lebanon. Certainly the dramatic decline, Jim, that you referenced early on is quite evident in the poll. It's reflected by UN statistics as well. 3/4 of Lebanese now live below the poverty line, and nearly a quarter are food insecure. And so, Jim, your reference of Lebanon being mentioned in the same breath as Haiti and Afghanistan, it is breathtaking, actually. The plummeting of quality of life that the country has experienced, really more in the past few years, I think is stunning and deserves just a moment of reflection. But at the same time, I think what I was most struck by is this vein of optimism and hopefulness, despite how difficult the circumstances are, that's reflected across various questions in the poll. And in particular, what gives me great hope is the faith that respondents put in the elections as a way forward, and the optimism they have with respect to life getting better. I mean, I'm really struck by that, and it is an odd paradox with 2 and 3 wanting to leave the country if they can. So I'd actually be curious as to Jim's thoughts on that, how those two things can sit side by side. But ultimately, I think you see clearly where it is that the Lebanese are concerned, but also that my own sense is that there's a way forward, a peaceful way forward, and that gives me great hope and optimism. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mona. Paul, any surprises for you in looking at this poll?
Yeah. Again, I mean, like Mona, I want to thank Jim for this and all the great polling he does, and thanks ATFL for, supporting it and organizing this meeting. There were some things, I suppose, that were expected, but, difficult and painful to see, and others that were surprising. Obviously, the socioeconomic data tracks with all the tragic data that we're seeing in our visits to the country as well. And the immigration data also tracks with what we've been seeing and hearing elsewhere. So very, very breathtakingly tragic and sad, but not maybe surprising. A couple of things that I would like to probe. One is the mix of sort of good and bad news, if you want, on the support of institutions. That obviously there's great support for the army, but there's almost equal confidence, I think was the word used in the poll, equal confidence in religious institutions, which to my mind is a little bit, if you want a state and institutions and a judiciary and an army, you wouldn't almost to the same degree say I have 80% confidence in the religious institutions. And also almost 50%, if I'm not mistaken, confidence, 48% in Hezbollah, an institution which negates the concept of a national army, negates the concept of a state. Maybe going to Muna's point, it's a complicated country and it does have a lot of contradictions. And that is a very seriously contradicted set of opinions, I would say. But I was very struck with, and positively so, maybe like Muna, with the very positive and surprising to me, confidence in the political future. The economic future maybe depends how you read it. I mean, if you ask people today, do you think things will be a bit better for you next year and the year after? They might say, well, it can't get any worse. It's got to get a bit better. So, that's optimism with a very small O. Maybe I can understand that. But the high level of confidence in civil society, I think it was around 75%. In the October 17 revolution, also around 65% maybe. And confidence that the elections would bring about real change, vast majority. That is much more than I expected. My visits recently to the country, I found people obviously very depressed because of the socioeconomic situation. And I found a lot of people kind of losing hope, thinking of just leaving the country. So this gives me a lot of hope that the population that's there has real confidence and real hope pegged on the elections. It indicates to me maybe a vast chasm between the Lebanese people and its leadership, or if I may say, its elites. Obviously, there's a low opinion, around 19% of traditional parties. But one also has to say that the economic elites, which ran the banks and so on, certainly, let the whole population down, have contributed to this collapse. And what troubles me is that the people want to move on through elections and change, but the civil society movements, of which we're all very closely in touch, have not managed to put forward a credible, more unified vision and a more unified leadership. So it's kind of a people in search of a new leadership. And if we consider even civil society groups, kind of elites, that are supposed to provide an alternative, they are trailing way behind the people who are saying we want it and we want to vote for it. It is not yet almost 2 years, not almost, 2 years since the revolution. We do not yet have that viable alternative, and that troubles me tremendously. I'll stop there for now.
Jim, any thoughts?
Well, I think Paul is, both Paul and Mona identify several critical issues. I mean, there are contradictions. I mean, I was focused on the points of convergence, but there are contradictions even within that. Support for Hezbollah at 48% seems to contradict support for the military at 89%, and the 19% support for traditional parties. But look, as I noted, there still is, despite the fact that Hezbollah is I guess I could call it the Praetorian Guard that protects the sectarian elites and that structure of governance, because they, like the other corrupt elites, get their section of the pie and they are able to divide it up among their supporters. They're the ones blocking the investigation of the port, etc. Despite that, they still represent to a significant percentage of the Shia community the resistance, and not just the resistance against Israel, but we demand a piece of the pie that we've been cut out of in favor of the Sunni and Christian community. There is that mindset there, and one can't deny that. There has to be a new system based on equity and on fairness to all the communities, in particular the poor. And Hezbollah represents a significant portion of the poor in Lebanon. The traditional poor. Not right now, everyone's poor, but before then, and the South that had been ignored for way too long. And so the contradictions are there, but I understand them. But I do think that there's a way to structure a vision of an alternative future that focuses on, as I said, these points of convergence. And Paul is absolutely right. I mean, there are these alternative parties there that are mobilizing. They did very well in the Beirut municipal elections. They did elect some independents the last time. I understand that if they can elect 9 members of the next parliament, they can become the decisive bloc that will determine what kind of government takes place in Lebanon. The question is, will they be able to project the kind of vision and charisma and confidence that gives people a sense that, this is what we want. We don't want the same family names that have been dominating politics in Lebanon now for 3 generations. I mean, when I went there in 71 and I go and you go today, you got the same names in parliament, just the grandkids or the great grandkids. And, can the alternative parties break that down and create a new leadership? Paul is really right about that. I mean, I think that's going to be the test. If they can't, and if this election ends up going the way of the past elections, I think, like I said, a breaking point. People will feel the hope that they have that something new might come of this is something you don't want to see shattered. And if I remember my feeling when Macron was there and walked the streets after the explosion, and it was emotional. I mean, France isn't always the good guy, but here they were doing something that till that date, no Lebanese leader had done, walk on the site and see the people and hear their pain. When he gave them an ultimatum and said, you got to fix this, what happened? The people who gathered together to deal with the ultimatum of reform were the very people who were the problem that need to be reformed. And you knew right then nothing was going to happen. People feel that, see that. Paul is right. There's a sense of that's why it's only 19% support for the traditional parties. If nothing new happens, I think Lebanon, it goes from the breaking point to being broken. I think right now, from the numbers we're seeing here, what is sustaining people is hope that election will make a difference. If it doesn't, I think it's not a good situation for the future.
That raises a really important question, Jim. One is the point you just made about vision. Where is that going to emanate from? Who's going to be the messenger? And that brings up the second question, is that do we fall back on looking for a leader, or is it possible to have a coalition of like-minded people who are politically savvy, who can change the political equation? And I've seen the numbers and I understand the strategy of building a small, compact group, which then affiliates with other groups that then becomes the blocking third. The reality is that despite the fact that that's a very difficult goal, there still is not a unifying vision, even though your poll results point to it. Number one is end corruption. Okay, so let's end corruption and let's feed the people. Okay, so those are the 2 basic issues right up front. And the articulation of that issue is being done by a lot of groups in Lebanon, individuals, but not a cohesive strategy, despite the fact that you have civil society groups coming together more and more in Lebanon.
That becomes critical. Look, one of the problems of October 17th was not just COVID and not just the fact that there were armed gangs that attacked them. I mean, that all happened, but there was it was too spontaneous. It was sort of like what happened in Egypt in Tahrir, spontaneous. It sustained itself, but it was unable to sustain for the long term because it lacked the kind of coherent organization and the transformation of that momentum into a political movement that could actually win elections. At the end of the day, that's what you got to do. You got to win elections. And so that's why this next election is a big test. Will it be one leader? Will it be a coalition of leaders? What there have to be are leaders that structure political organization that can make change once they're in office. It can't just be a charismatic person. Given the way Lebanon and any country that has a democratic past is organized, there has to be structure organization that can ultimately manage governance after the election is over. And that is the test of the alternative parties. Are they building that kind of we've seen that, Ross Perot comes and goes, Ralph Nader, we've had lots of those things happen in America, but unless they can create a sustainable political organization that survives the election and can continue to organize for change, then it'll all dissipate. And that'll be the test of the alternative parties, I think, in Lebanon right now. Paul, yeah, okay. Can I just ask Paul? Paul, sure. You saw what happened in Beirut in the last municipal elections. Has that movement sustained itself? Is it a factor in the next election?
Well, Beirut is, first of all, Beirut is Beirut. It's an urban city with different dynamics than a lot of the other electoral districts, which are much more rural and maybe not as prone to change. That movement itself did sort of divide, evolve, change a bit. It's no longer that exact same movement, but it's still there. And it's very much part of the attempts at coalition building that we're seeing across the board after the October 17 revolution. And one must say the efforts have been tremendous. And there's been some progress in building groups of coalitions. Week to week, there's meetings to try to get there. But it is certainly concerning to them and to people who observe that the civil society, the October 17, whatever these dozens and dozens of movements have not yet been able to present to the public a clear, coordinated coalition that is recognizable as an alternative. Now, maybe we still have a bit of time between now and the elections, and I know efforts certainly will continue. I do want to say, and this reflects also opinion among these groups in the country, that of course the next elections are tremendously important and all efforts must be put in that direction. But it's also to be recognized that this is a long-term struggle. This is a long-term change. It's not going to happen in one election. And we must gird ourselves for the long term. I think it's fair to say that the old system is dying, or is, I wouldn't say it's completely dead, but it's gravely, mortally wounded. But the new order has not yet emerged, and it's going to take time. So I look to the next elections in 2022, but I also look to municipal elections next year if they happen. I look to the choice of, well, the presidential elections as an opportunity next year. And I look to the 2026 elections just 5 years from now as an occasion as well. So as not to take too much of a short-term view. I was also struck, and maybe I should have mentioned this early on, by, again, maybe it's a little bit contradictory, but the fair amount of confidence in the Miati government, which would again seem to go against, the 19% support for traditional parties. This was pretty much a traditional type of government, and yet it garnered a fair amount of confidence and support. Maybe that simply reflects that people are desperate. Any help, any hope is something they will grasp and try to move forward on. Thanks.
Well, I wanted to move back to the people realm, looking at the people of Lebanon. And Jim and I think Paul both mentioned there really is a difference between urban areas and rural areas. For example, we were talking with General Othman, who's the leader of the ISF yesterday, and he was saying there are 17,000 polling places in Lebanon, 17,000 that they have to be present at. And looking at these numbers and how the poll was conducted and the people who were interviewed, what do we need to know more about people outside the urban areas? Are they as well struggling? Are they also trying to figure out where the next meal is coming from? Or, for example, health services or educational services? It seems to me that most of our interest is focused just by the reality of looking at the urban areas. But what about the rest of the country?
I think the poll suggests, and other data suggests, the suffering that we're seeing in Lebanon is not limited to simply the urban areas. This is something that is a nationwide issue. And so I think, you know, I don't think that we're forgetting anything. I do think it's important to understand a few things. One is we talk a lot about Beirut. We don't talk as much about Tripoli, which has its own dynamics and frankly, its own challenges that are in some ways more significant and more acute than what we're witnessing even in Beirut. The second is with respect to the elections themselves, and I don't want to get down into the nitty-gritty of electoral reforms and other things, but of course in Lebanon, people typically have to return to their ancestral towns and villages to vote. And that's difficult. And that, as you've raised, Jean, there are many issues around even managing all of these polling stations. And so the idea of having these super centers in Beirut, I think, and I don't know where that is, Paul probably is tracking that more closely, has appeal in that way in terms of easing, facilitating voting. But I actually want to go back to something, this discussion back and forth between Jim and Paul, because they're zeroing in many ways on what I think is the critical challenge for Lebanon going forward. And it's a perennial challenge we've seen across the Arab world with the various uprisings and protests, where the ability to turn civil protests into effective political coalitions that actually are able to affect change is sorely lacking. And Lebanon is just the most recent example. This is a challenge, the challenge I think that lies before the Lebanese people, most importantly, but also the international community, those that seek to help put Lebanon on a much more stable trajectory towards peaceful and gradual change. And I very much agree with Paul. This is not going to be solved in one election cycle. But I do think it's important for all of us to think hard about how to crack that real challenge of translating the vibrant ideas and the ideals. And I think it's not about lack of vision. The vision is clear in there, and it's very evident, by the way, in Jim's polling. The demand for an end to corruption, the demand for accountability, the demand for better governance and more effective services. This is a 30-year-long ineffective system of governance that Lebanon has been contending with. But how to translate those popular aspirations into effective political coalitions, that to me is really the key question that demands far more attention and thinking. And I wouldn't pretend to have the answers, but I think that's really what we need to be focused on going forward. And I think that to me is quite clear from the polling as well. The last thing I want to say is this use of the word resilience, which, and Paul can maybe comment on this. I think there's a lot of pushback now amongst the Lebanese people about the term resilience. And Jim, to your point, I think they truly are fed up. And, we're at a very important moment because on the one hand, the dire humanitarian conditions that Lebanon is currently experiencing really is pushing people to demand change. On the other hand, I think this kind of suffering also leads to a reflexive response to fall back on one's sect and on where one can feel protected and taken care of, particularly given the weakness of state institutions, the ineffective services, that the very poor services that the Lebanese people had. And so I think this is also an important dynamic and important tension to be aware of. And if the humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate, it's going to be that much more difficult to move the country forward onto a more stable trajectory. People will continue to fall back into their sectarian identity as opposed to reaching out and trying to move the country into a new path that discards the old system. And I again agree with Paul. I think Lebanon is betwixt and between. The old system is dying, but a new one has yet to be born. It's a moment filled with opportunity, but there's also quite a lot of peril in it. I'll stop there.
Yeah, but that's really an important point that you made. Let me just, if I may finish. This nadir took 30 years to hit the bottom point where we are now, and we don't have 30 years to repair it, although it may take that much time in reality. The question is, how do we get even started if we don't have a common sense of who we are as Lebanese? And I don't see a common sense emerging from the data except in opposition to something. It sounds almost like a US election. You know, we're opposed to something as opposed to for something. Paul, I'm sorry, you were going to add?
Yeah, I mean, you raised a very good question. I was going to comment first on a number of points. On the rural-urban issue, Lebanon is vast majority urban, even though people are still registered in their villages and they have to go back up to the village to vote. But I don't know what the actual, statistic would be. I would guess it's 80, 85%, maybe 90% technically urban lifestyle, particularly with the growth of technology, decentralization of the economy over the last years, even in my village in the north. Yes, it's a village, but they really live, in a sense, a urban lifestyle. So I think everybody's been impacted. And I think this shows up in the data that the vast majority of people are impacted or have these political views that are, you might say, are more urban political views of change and engagement and elections and hope and all of that. And that's a very positive sign. I think one, the important point that she raises, which we saw in Egypt and, in many other countries in the Arab Spring, is that the population, particularly the young population, is very engaged and very, and organizing a protest seems pretty easy. But organizing politically and winning an election seems extremely hard. I think when we talked about Egypt or some of the other countries, the explanation was, look, these were authoritarian countries where people didn't have the chance to really organize politically. So all of a sudden, they have an opportunity. They can't be expected in 9 months to, organize a party, which usually takes 2-3 decades to build. In Lebanon, you'd think that would be different. Because Lebanon was not authoritarian in the same way. But in a way, the reality of Lebanon over the last 50 years, if you take the last 30 years, the elites of the country did not engage in politics. They enjoyed the bubble. They enjoyed, the lifestyle, the economic growth. They left politics to the politicians. In the previous 15 years, politics, meaning in the Civil War, politics became basically armed politics and mafia politics, and that persisted after the war. The last time we really had politics in the proper sense of the term in Lebanon might be back in the 60s or the early 70s. What's very hopeful about this moment is, I think, the society and its elites, broadly speaking, 2 years ago, realized that politics is necessary and realized that organizing is necessary and realized that leaving politics to the traditional politicians and simply enjoying the fruits of the economy and the lifestyle without worrying about citizenship or engaging in politics, that was a tragic mistake. I remember when I was in high school in Beirut, and then I was at AUB, you can say that was, good high school, good university. I know of no individual in my generation, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I can't almost think of anybody of my entire sort of group who thought that engaging in public life or political life was a good thing, was a necessary thing, was an honorable thing. It was something laughable. That the thing to do is look after yourself, build your own career. And it was shocking to me. And I think that's come home to roost. This is a country whose society and elites did not engage with, let it be for all this time. And here we are. So what's hopeful to me is I think people have awoken that that was existentially the wrong thing, and have been working for the last 24 months. Some progress has been made. I think it'll take, 5 years, maybe 10 years, but I think we are in a new political moment in Lebanon, and I hope it doesn't die out, and I really hope that it doesn't.
James, you wanted to add something?
Just a couple observations.
Sure.
I do not see a contradiction between a fairly high level of confidence in the religious establishment as opposed to lack of respect for the traditional parties. One's religion, I mean, the parties have made their politics, their religion politics, or vice versa. But the religious establishment is something different. It's not a bad thing for, unless you're, just completely anti-religion, for someone to say, I respect Christianity, but I have no respect for the political parties that say they represent Christianity. So I'm not sure that I'm, and I think that in Lebanon in particular, supporting the patriarch, who has been outspoken against corruption and some of the traditional political parties, doesn't necessarily mean the same thing, right? Supporting the establishment doesn't mean you support those who claim to represent the religions, whether they be Sunni, Shia, Druze, or the various Christian denominations. The other thing is that with regard to the point that Mona and Paul were making, go back to October 17th, there were a couple million people in a country that's just a little bit larger than that, one might say. And they were chanting, all of them means all of them. I just saw this film that Daisy Jaroun made called Enough. And it was quite striking in making the point about corruption, but also about the fact that there is this very widespread disenchantment on the popular level. I remember going to see Ann Patterson, who had been ambassador in Egypt and then became Assistant Secretary of State. And I went to see her specifically when she was at the State Department to apologize, because I remember when Tamarrud was happening in Egypt, the mass demonstrations that called for Morsi to be thrown out and led to where we are today in Egypt. And she spoke to a civil society group in Egypt, and she said, I understand your frustrations, I understand your concerns, but mass mobilization has its place, but right now you should be forming political parties and winning an election. And they dismissed her and they said, this is, you're a traitor. They were just angry at her for not understanding that they were going to do this mass mobilization. And I actually wrote a piece, saying that the street was right, she was wrong. I went to apologize because she was right. She was right. The street had a role in expressing the discontent, but the street by itself does not make the change. There was no revolution in Egypt. What there was an uprising that was used by established, entrenched political forces, whether it was the military or the Muslim Brotherhood, and they used it for their purposes to consolidate their power in different ways. The street in Lebanon needs organization in order to win elections and make real change. And I don't think any of us are going to dismiss the difficulty of winning an election in Lebanon. It's not like you form a political party and you run for office. You know, if you're Armenian, you got to win the Armenian seat. If you're Maronite, you got to win. You know, you have to win within the sectarian breakout that exists. And so there needs to be wholesale reform of that. That's not going to come now, but certainly if you elect enough independent-minded people who form a bloc, even within that sectarian, a multi-sectarian bloc within this sectarian breakout, it could be quite powerful in helping to foster change. And that's where the optimism is. Now, it may be naive and it may be misplaced, but there is people and maybe grasping at straws, but people have a hope. They have a little bit of hope in Makati that, in other words, finally we're going to have a government. It's been approved. Maybe something can happen. Give them that. You know, they have hope in this election. Don't just give them that, but understand how critical at a breaking point the country is. They need to feel something can change, and they don't want to see it go back to exactly where it was. You elect enough people who can make change, it will create the momentum and the incentive for more change. But they need to feel that something's going to give, that at least a crack in the old system that will give them hope to make more change. And you know, I think all of us are infected by this this bug, Lebanon, that we love and we want to see get better and improve. And we all have that. Khalil Gibran, you have your Lebanon, I have mine, and the one that we love is the vision of the Lebanon that we you know, that we embraced as young people. They're at a breaking point now where if it doesn't change, more people are going to leave already. I mean, when I looked at the demographics of this poll, we only had 10% college educated. That means that already the brain drain has taken a huge toll. Those numbers were significantly lower than we'd gotten in the past. And it'll get worse. Almost 2/3 saying they want to emigrate. That's a desperation point, and it needs to, people need to feel something can give in order to sustain the hope that keeps them there and keeps them working for the future.
Jim, I want to move to our audience. We've been having quite a few questions come in, so please remember, go to the Q&A function for the questions. We've got a lot of them. One of the ones I wanted to start off with anyone who wants to respond to it, is I think a lot of what we're seeing, whether we're talking about the larger changes or in the poll by preferences people have, is the relationship of youth, young people, to some of the responses. For example, education being number 2 after corruption. Say my friend Serge Bakachian brings this up as an issue. Given the demographics of breakdown, Jim, are you surprised that education placed so high, which is also related to desire to emigrate?
You know, it would have been interesting to ask a question that made that connection. Where did they want to get educated so they could emigrate? I don't know. That wasn't the way we framed it. But yeah, the youth numbers on emigration were higher. The youth numbers on a number of issues were higher, and I think that there's a restiveness among youth. The settled population, the 40 to 60, were the ones that showed the least inclination to, you know, to want to either want to leave, I mean, or want significant change. It was the younger folks who are the driving force here. But you know, why education was as high as it was, it's always been high in Lebanon. Education, healthcare, and employment was always the highest. I was surprised that employment dropped to 4th place, although it was close. The next 3, the healthcare, employment, and education, or education, healthcare, and employment, were very close together, but far and away corruption was number 1. That was the principal concern. Yeah.
did you see any issues that were more salient for some groups as opposed to others? I mean, by confessional communities. Was there more of a response from Christian, Shia, Sunni to one question than to another? A lopsided kind of response?
Not really. There was an age difference that we saw. There was an income difference that we saw in some questions. I mean, people who were earning a lot more money did not, but there wasn't, the only issue that there was a sectarian difference on was Hezbollah. But otherwise across the board, there was, I mean, look, when the numbers are the way they are, you're going to get convergence. I mean, my brother taught me the rule of thumb early on that I've then seen play out. If the numbers are around 70%, then it's pretty much all the subgroups are going to be in alignment. And that's where we were on several of these questions. Traditional parties, 19%. That was across the board with every group. So yeah, I think that's how I'd answer.
Mona, I'd be interested. I'm going to ask you, Paul, for the same question. Implications of this poll for U.S. policy. Could you make sure your mute function off? There you go.
I mean, I think there are several. Jean, thanks for the question. First and most important, my big takeaway is this poll suggests that the U.S. must stay engaged on Lebanon. And not only because of the dire humanitarian conditions, where this is a country truly on the verge of, still on the verge of collapse, socioeconomic collapse, which would have dire implications for the US. So there are the humanitarian issues that really cannot be ignored. But I was so struck by the question about that put France as the country that the Lebanese people were most interested in strengthening ties with. And immediately what came to my mind is, well, that should be the US. And I think what we should learn from that is that Jim's comment, and I certainly thought of it as well when I read the question of Macron going and wading into the throngs of people and showing deep concern for the situation in Lebanon. It's important for the US to sort of harken back to the days when we were the preeminent soft power on the ground in Lebanon. And to my mind, there's nothing that suggests we can't recapture that. The other piece that I thought was really telling was the great disdain people had for both Syria and Saudi Arabia, which to me suggests a real fatigue with Lebanon being the playing field for regional proxy battles. And it's somewhat ironic because we should remember that both Saudi Arabia and Syria were the key elements in what led to the Doha Agreement in 2008, the so-called scene formula of these two countries coming together and helping to rescue Lebanon. One would wish that the days of Lebanon being viewed solely through the lens of various proxy battles come to an end, and that countries like the US engage with Lebanon on the key issues of the day that are of importance to the Lebanese people, and then by extension, maintaining Lebanese stability being of importance to the US. Last point I want to make is on the importance of elections and the US support for election monitoring, which is going to be, I think, critical, but also in advance of the elections, training. This goes to the points that Jim, Paul, and I have all been making, training for these independent political parties, support for civil society organizations, pushing for strong independent media outlets as part of any election. This is something the US excels at, and this is something I think the US should be much more engaged on in the coming, frankly, weeks, because the time is now short for when the election may be held. I'll stop there.
That's very helpful, Mona. Thank you.
Let me
Yeah,
just
Jim.
make a quick point. Oh, darn it. We were talking before about getting old and losing your mind. I'll let it go.
All right, we'll come back to you, Paul.
Yeah,
Paul, what about you? What policy implications jumped out at you from this poll?
yeah, I mean, I would track sort of with what I was saying. I think it reinforces a lot of things. Obviously, the humanitarian emergency, which is expressed, maybe again, it wasn't a surprise, but it confirms the socioeconomic humanitarian emergency. The US is already engaged, the international community is engaged, it must remain engaged. The support for the army comes out loud and clear. The U.S. is the main supporter of the Lebanese army. That's confirmed as the right or a supported choice by the Lebanese public. That's very good. The port blast comes out with tremendous 97% support, and that is an area maybe where the U.S. and the international community could do more. We've seen attacks on the Lebanese judiciary. It's clear that the Lebanese judiciary will not have the protection necessary to really undertake an investigation. So to the degree the US and the international community can move towards some kind of attention to this issue, that would obviously be very important and very popular. Support for the judiciary itself. Maybe the U.S. has traditionally supported the Lebanese army and the security forces. That's very important. To look for ways also for the international community directly to support the Lebanese judiciary as a national institution, I think is tremendously important. What also stands out is the optimism and the dynamism of the population that insists on change. I think many of us, and maybe the U.S. as well, became a bit jaded that the opposition hasn't really presented a viable alternative. They're not united. So that was losing steam. I think this poll reminds us that the people are still full of steam, and the people still want change and want elections and take them seriously. So I think this is kind of a wake-up call again for the US, the international community, the diaspora, that there is the potential for serious and major change if we can meet that potential. I'm not terribly surprised. I mean, looking at the numbers between France and the US, because the US certainly is identified as the main opponent to Iran and Hezbollah. Half the country supports Hezbollah, so obviously that half is not going to at all support the US, whereas France doesn't have that same image. So that number really didn't surprise me or take me aback. I would say that this reinforces the need for the US very much to stay engaged. On the Gulf number, I mean, to use Saudi Arabia as, I don't know, maybe you didn't ask about Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, all of the others. But that's an interesting question as to why that's the case. Part of it is, I think, as Mona said, people are tired of interference yet Iran has very high numbers. They seem, a lot of people who support Iran and Hezbollah like that. It is the case that Saudi Arabia and the Gulf have disengaged from Lebanon. And a lot of people in Lebanon, maybe they understand it, but they're kind of, disappointed or bitter. They feel they want the support of Gulf countries and they're not getting it. So it would be interesting to know, Saudi Arabia was very involved in ending the Lebanese civil war along with the United States. Saudi Arabia was very engaged in the economic revival that happened under Rafiq al-Hariri in the 1990s. And I think people were super appreciative of that. So that remains to be an interesting question as to why that number is as low as it is. Thank you.
One of the areas that
I remember now the two comments. One was about the Saudi Arabia number, understand that number was low before Saudi Arabia suspended all imports from Lebanon, right? Which I'm sure now would have caused the number to be even lower. I think that, there's the old, what have you done for me lately? You're right about the Civil War. You're right about the Hariri period. But in the last 20 years, Saudi Arabia has not been there. And frankly, the numbers for Iran in Lebanon, positive numbers for Iran in Lebanon, were at their highest in 2006 to 2008, as they were across the Arab world. I mean, Iran's favorable numbers in Saudi Arabia in 2008 were at something like 78%. When we asked in Saudi Arabia to name 3 leaders not from your own country in which you have the most respect, Nasrallah was first, Bashar al-Assad was second, and Ahmadinejad was third. Why? Because the 2006 devastation of Lebanon by Israel that the US stood by and watched, and some feel gave a wink and a nod of support, and the Gulf country, in particular Saudi Arabia, also did nothing. But Iran then came in with aid and support afterwards. And I think that, we've seen Iran's numbers plummet since Syria. I call it the nail in the coffin of an Iranian public support in the Arab world. But those numbers continue to drop. And now we see the Lebanese actually getting frustrated with Iran's manipulation of their country. But the Saudis have not been active on the scene in a constructive way. I mean, holding Hariri for a while, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think created some obvious dissatisfaction there. On the US role, I would only say that if we are engaged, being engaged, I would suggest treading quite lightly, because those high negatives, 33, are still something to consider. Our engagement has sometimes been a bit heavy-handed and sometimes transparently manipulative, and we have to be careful about that. I think supporting institutions, finding mediating institutions to work through to help deal with issues like corruption and employment and education. It's our soft power that's important. We sometimes use our aid in ways that become destructive. So I think that there needs to be a thinking through of the ways that we help build, restore confidence in Lebanon in America's role, and not be seen as simply the coat holder for Israel, as we've been in the past, or having an agenda in Lebanon that goes beyond what the Lebanese people want for themselves. I mean, so engage, yes, but carefully and without a clear, transparent agenda. It should be focused on what can we do for you, and not, what can we do for you so that you can do for us. I mean, right now Lebanon's in need. We shouldn't be putting terms on it. I would also think that in terms of monitoring elections, the Khater Center might work. I think there'd be European institutions that might work. I'm not sure that the confidence that we'd want the people to have in the election would be well served by something too transparently American government would be helpful at this point. If we want it to work, then find a way to keep, a bit of a hands-off approach, but support institutions that actually could do it, and do it with transparency.
Good advice, Jim. I want to point out to our audience that shortly, ATFL MEI, through our partnership, will be coming out with a policy paper addressing some of these same issues. And I think we will benefit from the wisdom that we picked up so far today. I've been very thankful to all of you. But since we got a lot of questions on the diaspora, I wanted to bring in Akram Khater from the Khater Center at NC State, the Center for Diaspora Studies. Akram, a lot of questions were about diaspora voting. Can the diaspora make a difference? What is the role of the diaspora? From your point of view, aside from the larger macro questions, what can we do? What can the diaspora be in terms of a support to Lebanon in this time of change?
First of all, thank you so much, Jean. And thank you, Ed and the American Task Force for Lebanon, for spearheading this incredibly important public survey, and for giving us the opportunity to partner with you on this project. And thank you, Jim, for incredible work that you've done. And of course, Paul and Muna, for your insightful thoughts on this matter. For those of you who don't know, the Khater Center here at North Carolina State University is focused on preserving and sharing the history of those of Lebanese descent in the United States and beyond. What animates our mission and our projects is our deep conviction that there's an existential and intimate link between the diaspora and Lebanon. That has always been the case. There's nothing new about this. For 150 years, the diaspora, whether it's South and North America, Australia, Sub-Saharan Africa, now of course in the Gulf region, have been in many ways deeply connected to Lebanon at so many levels. It's not simply at the level of remittances, although billions of dollars have been sent to help over the years, but also in terms of exchange of ideas and in terms of influences. Some of the first political parties in Lebanon were actually formed outside Lebanon. Here I'm thinking about the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, Al-Tons Hadi, Al-Kataib with Pierre Jmail, who was in Egypt. But more importantly, many of the people in the diaspora in the 1920s and 30s were fighting for the independence of Lebanon. So this is nothing new. And I'm really what both Jim, Paul, and Mona have all alluded to is soft power. And here's where the diaspora becomes very powerful. It is not only that the diaspora is a source of investment in Lebanon, although that is important, especially at this very critical economic time, but it's also a source of support and ideas, and of course now voting. We have the opportunity in this March election, if indeed it does happen, for us to vote in the 128 seats in the parliament rather than originally as planned for just 6 diaspora seats. I think this is transformative at so many levels. We have observed over the last month or so a real serious uptick in the interest of the diaspora in voting. We've conducted a survey of Lebanese Americans over the last 2 years, and generally speaking, when we ask them about elections in Lebanon, they have been very muted because they saw that as completely unproductive. However, over the last month, there have been incredible, uptick that we've seen from calls to us about how do we vote. What I think is unclear from the point of view of the diaspora, who are they going to vote for? There's a lot of confusion about the system, obviously, not only the mechanics and logistics, which is not surprising because what we experienced in 2020 and the very deep confusion about who's running the elections at that point. But more importantly, I think the idea of who to vote for, and here I go back to the very important conversation you guys had about the civil society parties and the alternative parties, and Jim's poll that showed us that a lot of Lebanese are voting for non-traditional political parties. But I think there's a desperate need to provide information about, well, who to vote for, what are the issues? Because for the longest time, as we all know, elections in Lebanon have been run by personalities. Nobody ever ran on, I will do X, Y, or Z, or if they did, it was just really just, the superficial thing. Rather, they talked about what political party, who their dad is, or mom is, or who is whatsoever. But folks in the diaspora certainly would like to hear about issues. And I think the poll that was conducted shows us what issues matter in Lebanon, and I would argue that those also matter to people in the United States, certainly who we polled, but also other places of the diaspora. So I think it behooves us to start thinking about how do we provide information in this regard, and how do we maintain this intimate existential link between the diaspora and the community there. And what I'm referring to here, if you think about a lot of the educational institutions in Lebanon, going back to Jim's poll and how education is important, a lot of those early schools were built around by money funded from immigrants. The most obviously, well-known is the Jaffet Library at the AUB, but if you think a lot of the village schools, the town schools, they're all funded from overseas. So my point is, and this is going back to Muna's argument, soft power is very critical, but how do we deploy it? It's not simply just the Lebanese armed forces, although that is important, and the judiciary is incredibly important. We have to sustain civil society, and that basically means sustaining education, infrastructure, environmental issues, and a host of other things, including jobs at the local level. So again, I think we need to start educating folks in the diaspora about what the elections are, who's running, what platforms are they running on, and then to provide them with venues for engaging Lebanon beyond simply being an ATM machine where everybody's calling upon them to give them money. We have to engage them actively. And this is, again, within the tradition of the diaspora. There's nothing new here. Obviously, when the famine hit Lebanon in 1915 to 1917, the diaspora community was giving freely. We supported up to 60% of the GDP of Lebanon in that time period. But we also, at the time, were creating educational and cultural institutions that were being sent back to Lebanon. And here, of course, I mentioned the ubiquitous Gibran Khalil Gibran, but others who transformed literature and sent it back and transformed ideas. So we have a very important role to play. And I would support very much what Jim said, that, not sidelining the US government, we can do that, shouldn't do that, but certainly foregrounding the diaspora as a soft diplomacy.
Thank you, Akram. That's very, very helpful. We're ready for final comments. So, Paul, my final question to you is, will there be elections?
Yeah, that's a 50-50 question. I mean, I see it 50-50. I mean, obviously, there are some preparations taking place, but there's also complexities in Parliament, the decision-making process that at any point could postpone them. or cancel them. Politically, we saw the clashes of just a few weeks ago. At any moment, those clashes, somebody could start those clashes and push the elections back. I know there is chatter, if you want, among some of the ruling class that they would like to push them off for a year. They would like to extend the term of parliament. The obvious reason being that the potential change in the elections is likely to happen mainly to the detriment of the reform and change movement, which is the president's and Gibran Basil's movement. That's where a shift might happen in favor of partly maybe the Lebanese forces, some other traditional parties, and some of the civil society groups. The Aoun Gibran Basil movement is an ally of Hezbollah. So Hezbollah might be reluctant to hold elections if they feel they're going to lose their comfortable majority. So I think there is still a great possibility that these elections will not happen. I think this is very significant for the US and the international community. While I wouldn't be surprised that Hezbollah and Amal and maybe others would, feel they've done this many times before, they can go ahead and do that. Maybe the Aounist movement itself, the president would hope that if parliament is extended, they would extend his presidential term, which every president dreams of doing. But I think the members of parliament who would have to approve this by law feel more vulnerable. And if they are aware that the US and the international community might sanction them if they go along with the cancellation of elections and prolongation of parliament, that is certainly a point of leverage. That's certainly something which would align with what the Lebanese public wants. They don't want these political bosses to cancel their right to speak. And I think we should be standing on their side.
Mona, that leads us to a question about whether or not their elections, will the US policy stay the course? Will we continue to be the largest source of assistance to the people of Lebanon, to the refugees, to the LAF?
My own sense is yes, but I think it's really important that the diaspora organizations like ATFL and others continue to raise these issues with US government interlocutors to underscore how significant the stakes are. I think, that's certainly my big takeaway from this morning's discussion is the stakes are super high. And I think the most important point I would make there is it's essential for US policymakers to understand that Lebanon's stability and well-being ties directly to our own national security interests. And so while there may be some quarters in US foreign policy who believe that why help Lebanon? Hezbollah has the preponderance of power on the ground, maybe better to let the country collapse. Clearly, I think that would be disastrous, certainly for the Lebanese people. It's sort of the height of cynicism to propose such a solution. But also, I think it would also be disastrous for US national security interests. So we need to remain engaged, and we need to put Lebanon's stability and the well-being of its people front and center.
Thanks, Mona. Jim, you've heard our analysts, our policymakers, our other people afflicted with Lebanon. What are your final thoughts in terms of how what you did, the work that you did, can be translated into motivation for the Lebanese diaspora in terms of helping Lebanon?
Yeah, I was struck by the comments of the three folks just now, and an idea started percolating in my head. If the numbers are right, and Lebanon is at a breaking point, and this election is viewed so critically by people as a source of hope for change, and if there is a concern, that these elections might be canceled because if there is change, the people who will pay the price are the members of parliament and the traditional political parties, who some of whom will be, disposed of in a way. Then there's a concern. There's a concern about whether or not the traditional parties, to save their own butts, will cancel an election. We've seen them do that before, and they might want to do it again. I would therefore suggest that as a policy initiative, maybe the task force on Lebanon could begin a petition, an online petition of people of Lebanese descent outside of Lebanon, on the absolute urgency, the insistence that there be elections, because Lebanon is at a breaking point, and we, will not be able to continue support for Lebanon if its traditional leaders cancel the election and stifle the will of people for change. I think getting a huge number of that sort would send a very clear message, both to the Lebanese people that we've got their back, but also to the traditional elites in Lebanon that they're on notice. I remember working with Warren Christopher when Hariri came the first time. They wanted a speech for him to give, and the line we used in the beginning was that the U.S.-Lebanon relationship has always been based on the Lebanese American community, and that was true. And it stopped being true during the Civil War because the community fragmented. But I think that they're, as Akram notes, people are in a different position today. I mean, they're watching it, they care about it, they want to see what they can do to help. And it's not as sectarian as it was, especially with the younger generation of Lebanese Americans. And therefore, without becoming ourselves directly involved in the internal politics of Lebanon, what we can do is support the fact that a democratic process ought to take place, and that the serving notice that our ability, our desire to be supportive of Lebanon is contingent upon a democratic election that is fair, free, and takes place on the date that was set, without being, something of that sort, I think would send a very strong message, would be really important to do. Not intrusive, but supportive. And I would encourage the task force to think about that, and I would be supportive of it, and we might be able to actually make a difference. So thank you all very much for the comments. Thank you for support for the poll, and thank those of you who are listening for your questions and comments.
And let me also thank the staff at ATFL, staff with Zogby Research Services, and our support, as always, from MEI for making this possible. And we look forward to seeing you at the next ATFL event, either ourselves or with our partners at MEI. Thank you, and have a great week.